Mearsheimer is not in any way a dove. In fact, I would argue, is basically he's the realist wing of U.S. imperialism. It was Biden himself who has reiterated, if Israel didn't exist, we would have to create Israel. He said this originally in the 1980s when he was a senator. I've been arguing again that the US president does not have very significant influence over US foreign policy. You can't run an empire if every 4 years you have another leader who comes in and significantly changes foreign policy. Bourgeois democracy is exactly what so-called democracy was in the age of the Greeks, the ancient Greeks. It was democracy only for the slave owners. Now it's democracy only for the stock owners, for the investor class. People will say, an authoritarian, all this nonsense propaganda. The US system is authoritarian. The Chinese system is objectively less authoritarian. I will absolutely defend that argument.
And this is the only video probably we disagreed on, was your coverage on the recent developments in Bangladesh. Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you're new to our show, hit that subscribe button. If you want to support us, you can be a member. Either way, watch our show, like, share, and do drop a comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest today, Benjamin Norton. Ben is an investigative journalist and an analyst. Ben is the founder and editor of Geopolitical Economy Report. He lived in and reported from Latin America for several years and is now based in Beijing. Ben, welcome back to India and Global Left.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I want to touch with Palestine, given the escalation in Israel-Lebanon border. The new Israeli strikes have killed more than 38 people. And a Lebanese state media has reported that F-35 warplanes were used in launching these missiles in southern Beirut suburb of Dahia, which killed more than a dozen leadership from Hezbollah. My question to you is that a lot of geopolitical analysts, people like John Mearsheimer, now claims that the US at the moment doesn't have a larger interest in expanding war or intervention in the Middle East, and it's just Israel that is trying to drag US into a wider conflict. There is a counter view which says that the US still has a very deeply vested interest in its empire in the Middle East. Whose view do you subscribe to and why?
Well, I'll start by saying that, obviously John Mearsheimer has made a lot of great contributions, but I think we should understand what framework he's coming from, because this is not that well understood. A lot of people who aren't familiar with international relations in the US academia think that Mearsheimer is like a dove because they've seen him talk about the war in Ukraine and justifiably point out that the US and NATO bear responsibility significantly for causing the war in Ukraine with the US-backed coup in Ukraine in 2014, NATO expansion of Russia's borders. But Mearsheimer is not in any way a dove. In fact, I would argue, is basically he's the realist wing of U.S. imperialism. I mean, so for instance, if you listen to Mearsheimer talk about China, he's an extreme China hawk. And basically, I mean, so he's the founder of the school of offensive realism in IR theory, and essentially argues that there's this anarchic world, there are no authorities above nation states, and that essentially any other state in the U.S. position would be acting in a comparable way, that all states are inherently aggressive and how they defend what they see as their perceived security interests. He doesn't distinguish between the systems of states, and basically says that if China were in the same position as the U.S., but with its system, that China would act in the same way, which I think is ridiculous. And I think this informs his view of Israel. So Mearsheimer is also known for writing this book, along with Stephen Walt, on the Israel lobby, essentially arguing that the reason that the U.S. so strongly supports Israel is because of the lobby. I think this is ridiculous. And this is a way that some realist imperialists would see the U.S. essentially arguing that, well, the U.S. would not be supporting this Israeli colonial project were it not for support the money and the influence of the lobby. No, that's ridiculous. I mean, Israel, this is this idea that Israel is the tail wagging the dog. It's outrageous. Israel is an extension of US imperialism. And honestly, at this point, the US influence in West Asia, one of the most strategic regions on earth, has become so weak that were it not for Israel, the US would probably be pushed out of this region. Now, it is true that the US does have military bases in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan. It does have significant influence. But even if you look at Saudi Arabia, historically a country that has been essentially a US client regime, its largest trading partner is China. Saudi Arabia is very clearly playing both sides in this new Cold War, encouraging closer ties with China and Russia. Saudi Arabia is considering joining BRICS, although it officially has not done so. So it really is pursuing this kind of non-aligned foreign policy, which would have been unimaginable a few decades ago. The United Arab Emirates is exactly the same, also joining BRICS. And Israel is really the last bastion of this colonial project that was created by the British Empire. And then after the 1967 war, it really became a kind of US protectorate. And then you look not only structurally at the fact that every single US president has strongly supported Israel, provided many billions of dollars of military support. There is deep interaction, training, exercises between the US military and the Israeli military. And there's the fact that Netanyahu himself is an American. He had US citizenship twice. He was educated in the US. He went to high school and college in the US. He got his first job in the US. Then he was working in Boston with Mitt Romney. Then he gave up his citizenship, but then he also became he worked at the Israeli embassy in the US. So, I mean, Netanyahu is an American. The point is that these projects are inextricably tied. Just as in order to understand where Israel comes from, you have to go back to the European Zionist movement, the political father of which was Theodor Herzl, who was expressly a European colonialist. He wrote letters to Cecil Rhodes, the genocidal colonialist in Africa, after which Rhodesia was named. And so Theodor Herzl comes from the European colonialist milieu. And then the British Empire in 1917 gives its blessing to the creation of Israel with the Balfour Declaration. And then, so the point is that Israel was always this kind of colonial project. So I don't agree with this analysis that Mearsheimer has put forward, that the US is not strongly supporting what Israel is doing. And these people who believe what US politicians say rhetorically, it was Biden himself who has reiterated, if Israel didn't exist, we would have to create Israel. He said this originally in the 1980s when he was a senator. He said, if you go back and listen to his full speech in the Senate, Biden said, the investment we make in Israel is the best investment we make, even better than NATO. He said Israel plays a stronger strategic role than NATO because he understands that without Israel, the US loses its very significant influence in West Asia, which again has been declining and waning. And also, it's not just the hydrocarbons. Clearly, that's very important. But if you think the fact that West Asia is this crucial region that connects the rest of Asia to Europe, that connects into the Mediterranean, that has multiple geostrategic choke points, not only, of course, the Suez Canal, but also there are many other strategic choke points. We've seen, for instance, now the Yemeni resistance has been trying to block access to the southern port in Israel. And furthermore, the Strait of Hormuz, which is probably the most strategic choke point on earth, that if there's all this discussion in Western think tanks and the Brookings Institution and such, that if there were ever a war, that Iran could block off like a full-on war involving Iran, that Iran could block off the Strait of Hormuz. So the reality is that, I mean, as a former U.S. Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, put it, Israel is an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the United States. So the reason I mention all of that is we can't understand what's going on now, especially with Lebanon and in general the possibility of the war expanding to involve a direct Israeli war with Lebanon and potentially with Iran. I don't buy this argument that the US is hesitant, because this is the media narrative that you have a bunch of obedient mouthpieces, stenographers in the media who get fed this information from insiders in the Biden administration who claim the US is trying to bring about a ceasefire. The US is trying to de-escalate. The latest term we've heard, which is outrageous, is that Israel's policy is de-escalation through escalation. I mean, this is a dystopian phrase. Israel is trying to de-escalate by escalating. I mean, so Israel is trying to bring about peace through war. I mean, it's nonsensical. This is what the marketing narrative is. But in reality, the US could stop all of these conflicts immediately if it were to say to Israel, we're no longer going to give you weapons. We're no longer going to give you ammunition. It has been acknowledged by top Israeli officials in Israeli newspapers like Haaretz that if the US were to end military support for Israel, Israel could not wage this war. So it doesn't matter if some unnamed US officials claim that they don't want Israel to escalate. They don't want a broader war with Lebanon. They don't support the relentless bombing of civilians in Gaza. They have to put their money where their mouth is. And they could end this war overnight if they said, we're no longer going to give you weapons.
In the context of the upcoming election, I think my question to you is, as a US foreign policy analyst, how do you look at the two-party? I'll come to the case of Ukraine, but just from the perspective of Palestinian people. There are some who say that the Republican Party, especially Trump, would be worse than the Democrats. And there are others who say that they are equally bad because essentially US foreign policies are controlled by the deep state. What's your assessment of the two parties?
Well, the reality is it doesn't really matter who US president is. The US president is nominally the commander-in-chief of the US empire, but we all know that when it comes to actual foreign policy decision-making, the president is quite weak, and there is a much larger apparatus. You can call it the deep state, you can call it the national security state, you can simply call it the state. You can call it an empire. You need some kind of apparatus to run an empire. How are you supposed to oversee 800 foreign military bases, constant operations around the world, constant wars? The reality is that, and this isn't even looking at the political economy element of it. I mean, the US economy is so inextricably tied to war. The military industrial complex is a huge part of US manufacturing. It's funny because we hear that, some defenders of the US neoliberal model would say that critics they exaggerate the degree to which the US economy has deindustrialized. And they say, well, the US is still, after China, the second largest producer of manufactured goods. But in reality, when you look at US industry, a huge part of that is the military industry. So the reality, and of course, we know that military contractors fund politicians from both parties. They have very significant influence. The whole lobby argument, especially like the Israel lobby, I do not find very convincing. Because the reality is that people say, well, AIPAC funds politicians, but that's how the US political system functions. It's not just Israel. It's every single industry. It's every single politician. Their campaign is funded by big companies, the financial sector, the real estate sector. This is how US politics works. It's not like Israel is some exception to that. And because the US is not a democracy. We all know that, of course, bourgeois democracies everywhere are not real democracies, but especially in the case of the US, it is capital that determines how all these decisions are made. It's so clear in the US election right now between Trump and Kamala. So basically, if you really want to simplify it, BlackRock is linked to the Democratic Party, the biggest asset manager in the world, and Blackstone is funding Donald Trump's campaign. The highest compensated executive on Wall Street, Steven Schwartzman, a billionaire, the CEO of Blackstone, this private equity fund, the largest alternative asset manager in the world, he is funding Donald Trump's campaign. And actually, Trump is, of course, he's a billionaire. The extent to which he was supposedly like this underdog candidate who was supposedly resisting the establishment, it's a nonsensical narrative. in this campaign, it's even more nonsensical because in previous campaigns, if you look at his campaign contributors, he did not get as much from the financial sector and other parts of big capital as the Democrats. But in this campaign, that's actually not true. In this campaign, there are a lot of billionaires and parts of the financial sector that are backing Trump. And it's very easy to explain why. Trump has said very clearly that he's going to continue the tax cuts that he gave to big billionaires, and he's going to extend them further, cut taxes even further. He also wants to bring down the corporate tax rate. And his argument is that we don't really want any taxes on the rich. Instead, we're going to have tariffs that will make up for lost revenue, which is hilarious. We all know that's going to lead to very high rates of inflation in the US. Now, in terms of foreign policy, I've been arguing again that the US president does not have very significant influence over US foreign policy. You can't run an empire if every 4 years you have another leader who comes in and significantly changes foreign policy. Again, the foreign policy apparatus oversees that, which is a massive apparatus involving many thousands of people in the State Department and the Defense Department, especially the Pentagon. I mean, the Pentagon does not change all of senior. I mean, well, there are a few top members of the Defense Department that are appointments, but the vast majority of the Defense Department, the vast majority of the State Department as well, continue regardless of who the US president is. Now let's look at the policies that they're proposing. Trump says he's going to end the war in Ukraine. I think he actually probably would, but I also think regardless of whether or not who wins, the war in Ukraine is going to end soon. Even if Kamala Harris wins, it's very clear. You don't have to be rocket scientists to see that Ukraine has been losing very badly, and Ukraine's invasion of Russia, attacks inside Russian territory, are a negotiating tactic. This is even being acknowledged by mainstream analysts in Western think tanks who are vehemently anti-Russian. They know that the Ukrainian military is in a very dire situation. The average age of Ukrainian soldiers fighting against Russia are between 43 and 45 years. I mean, Ukraine has very low reserves of ammunition. There are reports that there are huge numbers of Ukrainian soldiers that are just disobeying orders, so much so that the Ukrainian military had to allow for the first defense insubordination. They legalized insubordination because so many tens of thousands of soldiers who are being conscripted are just completely ignoring the orders made by their officers and are just leaving. They're just fleeing. So it's very clear that Ukraine is losing badly, and there needs to be some kind of process to bring about a negotiated settlement. It's inevitable. And clearly, the Democrats are not going to do that before the election because it would be a huge political blow. But honestly, I think even if the Democrats win, they're going to have to make some kind of negotiated settlement, not only because Ukraine is losing, but because there's a bipartisan consensus in Washington that China is the biggest so-called threat. Look at the article that was written by the CIA director, William Burns, Mr. Burns, and in Foreign Affairs magazine, the magazine of the Council on Foreign Relations, he said very clearly that Russia is only a short-term threat. China is the biggest so-called long-term threat. This is language that has been reiterated in the national defense strategy of the Pentagon and many other documents from the US government, saying that Russia is a short-term threat, China is the biggest long-term threat. And the CIA director said, he boasted that the CIA has doubled its budget for anti-China operations. The CIA has created a mission center focused on China. It's the only mission center the CIA has focused on one country. And this is bipartisan. In fact, this September, there was something in the US Congress known as China Week, where in 1 week, the US House of Representatives passed 25 pieces of legislation that were anti-China. 25 anti-China bills in 1 week. It's very clear what direction the political winds are blowing in. This is bipartisan. By the way, those bills had bipartisan support from Republicans and Democrats. So I actually don't buy this argument that some Trump supporters are making, that if Trump wins, he'll be a peace president, he'll end the war in Ukraine. That's outrageously stupid. No, regardless of who wins, there's going to be more war, especially on China. Trump, when he was president, this idea that he didn't wage any war is also outrageously stupid. Trump, in his own words, expanded the military occupation of Syria. He boasted that we're taking Syria's oil. Trump did not withdraw troops from Afghanistan. Biden has been a horrible, odious, reprehensible president. One of the only very few positive things that he's done. I mean, I can count them in one hand. Basically, nothing that he's done has been good, but he did withdraw troops from Afghanistan. I mean, he's backing a genocide in Israel. He's done all these horrible things. I'm not praising Biden. What I'm saying is that Biden did this thing that Trump said he would do. I'm not saying that Kamala Harris will be better than Trump. I think they both will be, again, indistinguishable. They will be the managers of the U.S. empire. So I'm not arguing that these people, it's funny that for decades we've been told by some leftists who are sympathetic to the Democrats that the Democrats are supposedly a lesser evil. And now we actually see some people reversing that and saying that Trump is a lesser evil. That's nonsense. It doesn't matter who the U.S. president is. And again, looking back in Trump's first administration, Trump waged war on Venezuela. There's this narrative that Trump didn't start a new war. Well, you can only believe that if you consider what he did against Venezuela not a war. It was absolutely a war. According to the former UN Special Rapporteur, Alfred de Sayas, and then if you also look at reports done by, for instance, Jeffrey Sachs and Mark Weisbrot, tens of thousands of Venezuelans died from the U.S. sanctions. Alfred de Sayas estimated more than 100,000 Venezuelans. I mean, we all know that sanctions are just as deadly as conventional war, if not deadlier, as we saw with the sanctions on Iraq in the 1990s that led to hundreds of thousands of deaths that were famously defended by Madeleine Albright. So this narrative that Trump didn't wage a new war, what he did against Venezuela was absolutely a war. Against Syria, he expanded the war in Yemen. He did not withdraw troops from Afghanistan. He backed many coup attempts. And Trump boasted of giving offensive weapons to Ukraine that Obama didn't give. There's this famous clip of Trump boasting. He said, Obama only gave Ukraine pillows and sheets, or pillows and blankets. I gave Ukraine lethal weapons. Now, obviously, that's ridiculous. Obama did give military equipment to Israel, although he claimed that it was non-lethal, which is like one of these euphemisms the U.S. government loves, like their claim that Israel is de-escalating by escalating in Lebanon. So, of course, Obama backed the coup in Ukraine. He did give military equipment to Ukraine, but Trump also expanded that even further. The Trump administration, Trump voluntarily appointed as his national security advisor one of the most hardline neoconservatives, John Bolton, and his Secretary of State was first Rex Tillerson, an oil executive, which says a lot about what interests the U.S. State Department serves. And then after Rex Tillerson, it was the former CIA director, another hardline neoconservative, Mike Pompeo. So Trump voluntarily appointed them. No one forced him to appoint these neoconservatives as his top national security officials. And then Trump, his administration tore up the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and he tore up the Open Skies Treaty. So destroying all of the late Cold War or 90s arms infrastructure, arms treaties with Russia, which only further exacerbated the situation and pressured and encouraged Russia to seek written security guarantees after the U.S. had torn up past security treaties, arms treaties. So I don't buy this idea. And obviously we all know that Kamala Harris, she will not run her foreign policy. She has no foreign policy experience. Every time she's asked about it, she puts her foot in her mouth. She's very ignorant. I like to point out that as vice president, when Kamala Harris was given the mission to go to Central America, she famously said, "Do not come." She insulted everyone she spoke with in Central America. And then when she went to Vietnam, she insulted her Vietnamese hosts by laying a wreath at the site where war criminal John McCain was shot down, when during the Vietnam War, John McCain was bombing Vietnamese light bulb factories. And So she has no foreign policy experience. If you look at the people that Kamala has around her as her foreign policy advisors, they're from the same coterie of think tanks in Washington who all support the same policies. So no, I don't buy this idea that U.S. foreign policy will be any different. If you read anything from a mainstream think tank in Washington, from the Rand Corporation, it's all clear that the U.S. is focused on the new Cold War on China, moving more forces to East Asia, expanding the network of U.S. military bases in East Asia. The U.S. has done this by creating 4 new military bases in the Philippines, and the new leader of the Philippines, who's the son of the former, U.S.-backed dictator Marcos, he is greatly deepening his country's relations with the U.S. We see that in Japan and South Korea, they're solidifying their military partnership with the US, talking about expanding NATO into the Pacific region. I mean, of course, there are a few outliers here, which is like, India, a major outlier. Vietnam, although I actually think Vietnam's policy is very clear of non-alignment. They're not going to get involved. Indonesia maybe could be one of these countries that goes either way, although Indonesia is leaning much more toward China. But the reality is that regardless of who wins, foreign policy will be basically the same. What I think actually could be a little different is economic policy. That is actually usually in presidential elections, basically 95% of policies will be exactly the same. The only differences really are economic policy around the margins. Maybe like they'll change like the amount they tax the rich by 2 or 3%. And maybe obviously cultural policy, things like abortion, which is obviously very important. I'm not saying that's insignificant, but in this election, actually, one area that is quite different is the issue of tariffs. If Trump wins, I think he is serious about massively expanding tariffs. Clearly, the Biden administration and the Democrats are not opposed to tariffs, but they only are using targeted tariffs against specific Chinese technologies, electric vehicles, semiconductors, quantum computing parts with export restrictions. Also, of course, solar panels, critical minerals. But if Trump comes in, he is very serious about across the board expanding tariffs, not only in China, but in other countries. And he says that he wants blanket tariffs of at least 60% on all Chinese goods, which, by the way, would result in quite high inflation in the US. So again, foreign policy does not change regardless of who the US president is. It's an infantile view of how US foreign policy operates and is made. And economic policy could be a little different. And, Kamala Harris, obviously, I'm not expecting her in any way to tangibly reverse the decades of neoliberal policy. She is talking about maybe having a tax on unrealized capital gains. They may do that, but even if they do that, I don't expect it to be very high. I think it will be mostly symbolic. And I don't think she's going to cut taxes on the rich even further like Trump will. But even then, the majority of their economic policy will probably still be the same.
I found your take on Russia-Ukraine interesting because, I think it is very, very obvious that in the case of Palestine or China, both the parties are they have the same policies. But I was reading Foreign Affairs and I found column is there to be divided. There are some, as you referenced, who would say that our greater priority is China, and so maybe it's not a good idea to keep pushing this war in Ukraine. But there are many hawkish in foreign affairs who still double down that, and there is great anxiety about coming back of Trump, because they think, at least, whether it's true or not, we don't know, because as the New York Times documents show clearly that since 2017, CIA operations in Ukraine massively increased. This was in the period of Trump. I thought things are not as clear on what's going to happen in Russia, Ukraine, but what you were suggesting is that it's going to be the same.
Yeah, well, again, you also have to understand the party apparatus. We talked about the national security apparatus. So the fact is that in the Pentagon and the State Department, the vast majority of officials stay the same regardless of administration. It's especially true for the CIA. I mean, we don't even know we don't know the majority of what they do. But in terms of the parties themselves, institutionally, both parties are deeply committed to antagonizing both Russia and China. So Trump does represent a small branch within a small faction within the Republicans who are a little more critical of Ukraine. And there's this idea that they love Russia. I mean, I think that's obviously exaggerated. It's not that they love Russia, but they want Russia to, at the very least, not be a US enemy so they can focus on China, or in an ideal scenario, they would like to ally with Russia against China. We know that's never going to happen. The fact that Russia started this new phase of the war is an acknowledgement that they recognize that their economic future, it lies with integration with Eurasia, with China, India, the other major growing economies in Asia. Of course, China is by far Russia's biggest trading partner, and they have in terms of where they specialize, they have economies that go together very well. Of course, Russia has some of the world's largest natural resource reserves of major minerals, of oil, of gas. China is the world's manufacturing superpower, but also Russia does have significant industry, and they can be complementary in certain ways. So, for instance, Russia's military technology is more advanced than that of China, and they've been collaborating. So, obviously, this idea that the Trumpists have that they could ally with Trump against China is cartoonishly absurd. But if you listen to the rhetoric of, for instance, of people like Steve Bannon for years, even before Trump was campaigning for president in 2016, Bannon was saying that China is the Antichrist. China is everything that he and those kind of far right Republicans hate. It's a country, a socialist country led by a communist party. It is atheistic. It is non-white. And they see Russia as capitalist since the overthrow of the Soviet Union, as Christian, as white, as European. But again, that misunderstands the geopolitics and the economics of the situation. But I mean, even actually Henry Kissinger famously had argued for this reverse Kissingerian triangulation strategy of trying to, improve relations with Russia to isolate China. It wasn't just Trump and Kissinger and Bannon. It was actually the first Obama administration and the Hillary Clinton State Department. This fact is often forgotten because Clinton is such a hawk. But right when she came into the State Department in the first Obama administration, she famously met with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and there was this stunt where she had a red button that she pressed for resetting Russia relations. Clearly, we saw what happened there with the coup in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia and the massive deterioration in U.S.-Russia relations. But there was a moment where it could have been possible. Bush famously met with Putin, and he said, I met with Putin. I looked into his eyes. I saw his soul. I saw that he wants, he's a good man and wants the same thing as that we do. There was a moment where it could have been possible, but for a variety of reasons, expansion of NATO, the refusal of the US-led West to allow Russia to economically integrate on equal terms with the West. Russia, because Putin is a nationalist, because the Russian ruling class, although certainly they're not socialists, they do have their own national interests, and because the US-led Western institutions refuse to allow Russia to integrate on equal footing, they were forced to, because of their own economic and national interests, to ultimately stand up against what the US and NATO were doing. And then Putin gives his famous speech at the Munich Security Conference in 2008 and announces that, there's this new attempt to bring about hegemony. He used the term hegemony. So the point is, anyway, fast forwarding, if you look inside the Republican Party, that kind of idea is still a minority. The majority of the Republican leadership in the Senate and in the House is still extremely pro-Ukrainian. Look at people like Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham has taken all these trips to Kiev. He stands with Zelensky and says we have to keep arming Ukraine. He also says we need to get their tens of trillions of dollars of minerals and prevent China and Russia from getting their minerals. So again, even if you believe that Trump is somehow deeply committed to peace, which I do not believe, and you believe that Trump, he wants to stop all of these wars, which I do not believe, you also, even if he wins the presidency, you have to look at all of the structural impediments. I mean, this idea that the US president just controls all of this policy and can do whatever he or she wants, again, is an infantile view. You have to have a structural analysis. And the reality is that Trump may believe whatever he believes, but he's working within a party that is full of people who are deeply committed to the US imperial project, a key part of which is weakening and ultimately balkanizing Russia. That's the goal. It's to carve up Russia, as Brzezinski famously had proposed in the 1990s, creating a European Russia, Siberian Russia, and an Asian Russia. I mean, ultimately, they're institutionally committed to deepening this project of destroying Russia, and that only incentivizes Russia further to deepen its integration with China and Asia as a whole. And one person, even if it's the president, cannot get in the way of that.
Talking about empire, democracy, and election, and I want you to be brief on this. I mean, I remember from our last discussion when you were on our show, and this is like an uncharitable reading of what actually you said, just to provoke you a bit more. I'm wondering what's your take or thoughts about the third party, particularly Jill Stein, presidential candidate from the Green Party. Are you still completely hopeless about democracy within empire, or do you think someone like Jill Stein can be helpful both for American people and world peace in general?
Well, I wouldn't say I'm hopeless about democracy. I'm hopeless about bourgeois democracy, capitalist democracy, which is not democracy. We all know that. I mean, and China has done an important service in trying to rescue the term democracy. There's not only one model of so-called democracy, which is where every 4 years you have people go to the poll to vote for 2 representatives of billionaire oligarchs who want war around the world. And you have no other options. You have no other contribution to the government, to policy. Policy is made by corporate lobbyists. I mean, that's not democracy. If anyone calls that democracy, I mean, they're fooling themselves. But the reality is that the US system is designed in a way where democracy is basically impossible. So, I mean, I think democracy would be good, an actual real democracy, which can't happen under a capitalist system in which politics is completely controlled by the capitalist class, the ruling class that buy politicians, especially in a system like the US, where with Citizens United, there is no limit on the amount of money that can flood politics. And in the case of a third party, I think I do agree that we have to use every means that we can to resist this system. And I support anyone on the left running third parties. I think it's important to get your message out there so people can hear that there can potentially be alternatives. But I think we should not fool ourselves and try to tell people you have to vote for Jill Stein because she can win. No, everyone knows that she can't win. The third party can't win. And this is, I mean, if the Green Party actually came close to winning, they would either destroy the Green Party or they would co-opt the Green Party. I mean, this has happened in so many. Look at what happened to Jeremy Corbyn. Just a complete, not just co-optation, a complete sabotage, destruction involving parts of the British security apparatus, intelligence agencies, the media. So I think we should support people to vote third party if they're not going to vote, simply as a protest. And it's important to have someone campaigning on a pro-peace platform. Also, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, the PSL, has a very important campaign running with 2 great candidates. And I think that they can definitely also have a positive impact. They're on the ballot in I think over a dozen states. So I mean, these are protest campaigns. But I don't think in our messaging, I think it's a waste of time to try to convince people. I think it's honestly it's puzzling why you would try to convince people that you should vote because there's a chance that they can win. They know they're not going to win. That's not the point. The point is to run as a protest candidate and to actually have peace as a possibility, to talk about imperialism, to talk about war, to talk about capitalism. Like these are issues that are never mentioned ever. You look at the presidential debates, they have no discussion of war, no discussion. Certainly, they would never mention the word empire or imperialism. They would never mention the word capitalism. So it's important to have those issues on the table.
On that note of cynicism about bourgeois democracy and empire, if you could tell
It's
us
not
your
cynicism, it's realism. I mean, this is,
yes,
bourgeois democracy is exactly what so-called democracy was in the age of the Greeks, the ancient Greeks. It was democracy only for the slave owners. Now it's democracy only for the stock owners, for the investor class.
yeah, I think I was thinking more about the potential future in the global north. But uh, anyway, either way, my question is if you could tell us a bit more about the differences you have experienced living in China. You have lived in the US, you have seen the system from within, you have also reported about the US system, and you have also seen the Chinese system. And I thought it might be of people's interest to learn a little bit about if China presents a different system, whether it's economic system or political system, that might be of interest to others, or at least to know what they are doing. So tell us a little bit about what are the essential differences that you experienced when you lived in China.
Well, I absolutely think that China is an alternative economically and politically. And I think many countries around the world can learn from China. Also, an advantage of the Chinese system is that the Communist Party would never, ever say that another country should simply adopt our system. That's the whole point of the concept of socialism with Chinese characteristics, that each country, its social system is a product of unique material conditions, and those material conditions should be manifest, or the social system should be manifested based on those specific conditions, that each country can learn from China's model, but also implement it according to its own national conditions. And there's a lot that we can learn from China. First of all, that okay, China doesn't have the same system as the Soviet system. And honestly, after studying more of the Soviet system, I think the Soviets accomplished a lot, providing job guarantees, social benefits, very good quality of life for everyone and not just a small percentage of the population. But I think also, I think a lot of people will probably accept now that having a complete command economy with no market forces is also probably creates its own set of problems. And I think China has been experimenting, sometimes leaning more in one direction than the other, with trying to find how to balance planning and a market. Because there's this idea that after the reform and opening up in 1978, that China completely abandoned planning. That's not true. China still has 5-year plans. And in addition to the 5-year plans, which are very macro level plans, China has very specific plans for targeted industries. Like, for instance, electric vehicles, which are referred to as new energy vehicles. China created a plan for how they're going to develop an electric vehicle industry, which was very successful. And you can call it industrial policy, but unlike US industrial policy, which is really just giving subsidies and tax breaks to big corporations, but not actually disciplining those firms in any ways, certainly not using state-owned enterprises, not investing significantly in infrastructure, not making targets for certain, not making benchmarks for where these firms have to meet. I mean, Chinese industrial policy is much more complicated than just saying we're going to give tax breaks and subsidies. And it's been remarkably successful. But you also, I think they recognize that you don't have to have every single hotel and restaurant and, low-level enterprise run by the state, especially when many of these enterprises are actually, they're profit losing, and then that's a drain on the state. So there are people in China who have criticized the reform for going too far, especially in certain regions like the Northeast, the Dongbei, which led to deindustrialization of the Northeast. So, I mean, obviously, if you look in the past 40 years in China, there have been periods at which the political economy has leaned more toward the state and more in planning and less toward the market. In moments where it's leaned more toward the market, especially in the 90s, it was kind of like a Wild West period. But we're in a period now where the state is reasserting more control. And something that a lot of people can learn from the Chinese economy is, I think every country should have this idea that China has, where the state-owned enterprises are concentrated in the commanding heights of the economy. And we can sit here and argue about what percentage of GDP comes from state-owned enterprises. It's an interesting argument. I don't think it's insignificant. But I also think it kind of misses the forest for the trees, because when we just measure GDP and say number go up, therefore good, it misunderstands that certain industries, certain sectors of the economy are much more important. So we see this in the US, where people say, look, US GDP number go up. But then you realize that much of that GDP growth has been in the healthcare industry, which is horrible, completely privatized, dystopian. It's been in finance, which does not contribute to actual the real economy in tangible ways that make people's lives better. And it just means increasing loads of debt. Whereas you look in China, the state-owned enterprises are concentrated in the most important sectors of the banking system, which should be publicly owned everywhere, in telecommunications, in infrastructure. And if you look, for instance, China, it's true, does have now over 100 companies that are listed in the Fortune 500 international, of the biggest 500 companies around the world by revenue. But the vast majority of them are state-owned enterprises. And they're SOEs, which are concentrated largely in infrastructure development. Whereas the US has a bunch of SOEs in finance, some in big tech. China's SOEs are concentrated in these tangible industries that are used to actually make people's lives better and more comfortable. There's also public transportation. I mean, when you compare the US and China, it's a joke. I lived in New York for several years, New York City. The public transportation in New York is atrocious. I mean, it is honestly shameful. This country that claims to be the richest country in the world, which it is not, and this city, which is really the only major city in the US that has a very well-developed public transportation system. There are smaller metro systems, subway systems in, LA and Chicago and some other big cities, but they're not very well developed compared to New York. And it's a joke. The US subway system is falling apart. There has been a major lack of investment. It's extremely expensive, despite the fact that, that's making up for the fact that there's not much significant investment by the state. It's now like around $3 for one trip on the subway. And obviously you have to adjust for different income levels. But in China, if you go on most subway trips, it's like 3 to 5 to 7 yuan, which is between like 30 cents to 70 cents to $1, depending on how far the trip is. So, I mean, it's just, again, even if you adjust for income levels, it's outrageously expensive in the US for this horrible system. You just look at photos. I mean, I've been on the subway in New York City, in metro stations that you just look around you and everything's falling apart. It was obviously, the subway station was built in like the 60s and it has never been updated, never been renovated. There's also the issue of safety. I mean, the US is an extremely violent country, and why that is, it's a very complicated social phenomenon. Obviously, a big reason is because there's an insane number of guns. There are more guns than people, more than 400 million guns. It's very easy to get a gun. You can just go to a Walmart in many states and buy a gun without a license. That's obviously part of it, but it's not just that. There are people who point out that, there are higher rates of gun ownership, or comparable rates of gun ownership in Yemen and Switzerland. And so, I mean, the US is just simply a deeply violent society. You could say it goes back to its origins in settler colonialism, the apartheid state that existed in the US, the brutality of slavery and Jim Crow. I mean, the point is that in China, there's nothing remotely comparable. China, at least in the big cities, I mean, I've been to the countryside, but I haven't lived in the countryside, so I can't speak from experience. But in the big cities where I've lived, I mean, there's no violent crime. Basically, it's non-existent. I mean, very, very isolated instances. I mean, and especially talking to female friends, like the freedom that they have, being able to go out at night whenever they want and not being afraid, that is a freedom. Like there's this idea that the US has that we're the freest country, which is nonsense. You're not free if you're afraid of going to school or a grocery store because people are going to shoot you. You're not free if you, as a woman, if you're afraid of going out at night because you might be attacked. Whereas in China, that is a major social freedom that people have. And then getting back to the political system, I mean, people will say, you know, an authoritarian, all this nonsense propaganda. The US system is authoritarian. The Chinese system is objectively less authoritarian. I will absolutely defend that argument. So, for instance, you go to any major city in the U.S., in addition to all of the violence that I was talking about, all of the mass shootings, police are everywhere. The U.S. is a deeply militarized society, and police are heavily armed, not with just guns, but with military equipment that is given to them in fire sales by the Pentagon because they have to justify all of these contracts for the military-industrial complex. So all of this old military equipment they sell for pennies on the dollar to local police departments. So you have all of these reports of local police in small towns in Texas who are driving around in armored vehicles. It looks like they're in a war zone. The U.S. is one of the most militarized societies I've ever been in. I've been in a little over 30 countries, and by far the U.S. is the most militarized. It has the most police, the most guns everywhere you go. People are the most afraid of the state. Not just, so I also spent a lot of my time living in Nicaragua, another country. I'm also a dual citizen of Nicaragua, a country that is demonized endlessly with ridiculous propaganda in Western media. Meanwhile, in Nicaragua, you only see a small fraction of the police. There are almost no guns. People are not afraid of the state. They're not afraid that the state is going to brutalize them if they argue with a cop. What's funny in China is it's very common to see people argue with police, especially elderly people. They're constantly yelling at police and they don't do anything. If you yell at a cop in the NYPD, they will arrest you. They will attack you. I mean, we've seen these recent reports in the US of someone who jumped the turnstile in the subway, which is, so they didn't pay like $3 and they were shot. And by the way, not only were they shot, other people around them were shot at. So, I mean, there's this obsession with the political system and saying that it's only about elections. The US is supposedly a democracy because every 4 years, a candidate funded by billionaire oligarchs who supports war and genocide around the world, you can choose between one of these nearly identical candidates. Therefore, you're a democracy. China is supposedly not a democracy because they don't have bourgeois elections in the same way. Although actually, by the way, China does have local elections for representatives in the National People's Congress who represent, and they also have elections for representatives for local assemblies. I mean, there are elements of local democracy, electoral democracy in China. China has what it refers to as a consultative democracy and whole process people's democracy. In fact, at my website, Geopolitical Economy Report, we published an article that goes into detail explaining how Chinese consultative democracy works. But even in addition to that, the reality is that the Chinese system is more democratic in the sense that the government is more responsible to what the people want. That's the definition of democracy. It's not having an election every few years for representatives of capitalist oligarchs and the military-industrial complex. In China, when people demand a policy, when there are protests, the government almost immediately responds and implements those policies. Whereas in the US, when people protest, the police brutalize them, they arrest them, they attack them, they run into them with armored vehicles. As we've seen, let's not forget the massive protests in Black Lives Matter over years, not just the protests at the end of the pandemic over the killing of George Floyd and just the brutal police brutality that we could see. I mean, objectively speaking, the US state, in terms of the way it deals with its people, is one of the most violent states on earth, and how it brutalizes its people. Over 1,000 years killed every year by US police. But the problem in the US, and not just the US, in fact, in Europe, it's worse. There is this obsession with bourgeois democracy. It is a religion. they deeply believe at their very core that you have to have elections every 4 years for some representative of the capitalist class who is funded by big corporations who will obediently do what they want and will not do what the people want. But if you don't have that, you're authoritarian. It's a deep religion. They believe in bourgeois elections, despite the fact that they know that these politicians will not do what they want. I mean, it's so funny. You hear people at the same time say, oh, yeah, the US is a democracy. The Western European countries are democracies, and China is a dictatorship, supposedly. And then they'll also say, oh, yeah, well, all politicians are corrupt. All politicians, they ignore us. They don't do whatever what? That's not a democracy. Democracy is rule by and for the people. And if you recognize that your political class are only representatives of big corporations and billionaires, it's not a democracy. It's a plutocracy. That's what actual capitalism is. It's democracy only for the capitalist class. They control the state. And you can see this even reflected in some mainstream scholarship. There's this famous study that was published by scholars at Princeton and Northwestern University, and they did a quantitative look at policymaking in the United States, and they found quantitatively that average people have no influence, negligible to no influence on policymaking. Meanwhile, large corporations, lobby groups, they determine what policy is. That's not a democracy.
One of my first experiences in the US was meeting this couple in my neighborhood who said that they were recently diagnosed with diabetes. And they said that now a significant portion of their income goes in buying insulin. And I was like, I mean, I knew about the insanity of US healthcare system, how the insurance company and the whole system is actually for-profit system. But I was so stunned listening to how much of their income goes into insulin, even coming from India, whose welfare state has always been very, very limited. But because we didn't protect the intellectual property rights, most people, I'm not talking about the very poor, and India has a lot of very poor who might find it difficult to buy insulin. But generally speaking, for even lower middle class, people would not struggle to buy insulin, even though in the recent years, pharmaceutical prices have risen in India, but it's nowhere close to what it is in the US. And one of my first experience in China was to go through these mandatory health checkups. And I was a foreigner, so it's not subsidized. And I got like 19 checks, including blood test and ECG, for just 350 yuan. That might be like $49 or $50. This, I think, is like,
Do you have health insurance?
I had to buy a health insurance in China when I was
Okay.
there. It was very cheap, but
Because obviously, depending on the plan, the health insurance plan is very cheap, and depending on the plan, it'll be absolutely nothing.
I
But
didn't
yeah,
have
it's not
the health.
surprising.
I didn't have the health insurance when I had the checkup, because the checkup was on the first day when I arrived there. But that was the difference. I'm also glad, and this is essential to understand global capitalism, given how much of capitalism share, even GDP share today, comes from healthcare, along with, of course, fintech and real estate and so on. One last point on security.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
no, on the point really quickly on healthcare, I just want to mention in the United States, the most common cause for households, the most common cause of bankruptcy is medical debt. And the most common form of medical debt is cancer treatment. So you have a lot of people in the US who get cancer or some other very significant diagnosis, and they literally go bankrupt. They lose all of their savings and have to end up selling their homes because they were trying to pay for treatment to not die. I know this is obviously anecdotal, but I know a woman in her 40s who got cancer pretty young, and she had a house and she had to sell her house in order to pay for her cancer treatment. And she had insurance, by the way, because even with the copay and all of that, like you're paying hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And that's supposedly the richest country in the world. That's supposedly the freest country.
I have some of this experience in the US in dental care, and most insurance would pay lip service saying that we cover dental care, but they would never pay for any even the most basic like cleaning up your two teeth or even root canal or something they never cover. And I met many poor people in neighborhood of Chicago, Englewood, for instance, one of the poorest neighborhoods in Chicago, where people literally went bankrupt because they couldn't afford dental care. Um, and real quick on the security, I mean, I was very impressed in China to realize how safe Chinese cities are. And it's I'm so glad you spoke about the gender component. I'm sorry, because coming from India, I mean, we don't have guns as well, so we don't have this militarized state, violence in the U.S. sense of gunfires and so on. But Indian cities are incredibly unsafe for women. And I was so pleased to see so many women and children coming out in the streets at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. And not just in Beijing, but even the smaller cities I went, like in Suzhou. And by the way, like even the smaller cities and the bigger cities, they are not very different qualitatively speaking in terms of infrastructure, right? Um, so it's a very different lived experience, definitely. I want to we're coming to the end. If you
Wait, sorry,
Yeah,
can I make one quick note?
please, yes.
I just want to say that, and there are some people who say this is cultural. They say, oh, it's because the Chinese people are culturally, they're not as prone to violence. I think that's a ridiculous argument. This is a product of good government policy, of state policy, because if you look at China, for hundreds of years, there were always, you can talk to anyone from China. Obviously, they weren't alive then, but people, there are so many stories of bandits, because the Chinese state was so weak for thousands of years, right? There were warlords. And the reality is that it's very common throughout Chinese history that there was a lot of instability, violence, crime, organized crime, obviously in Hong Kong until relatively recently. And Chinese culture has not changed that much in this time. Like this idea that they're just inherently peaceful. And then even if you look since the revolution, there are elderly people in China who lived back through the 40s, 50s, 60s to today. And I've spoken with some elderly people who've talked about the massive difference they've seen in safety and how that's one of the biggest accomplishments of the revolution. I really think, obviously, it's so important to talk about the poverty alleviation, 800 million people being lifted out of poverty, the infrastructure development, all of that. But safety is so important. And this idea that it's just cultural is nonsense. It's because if it's supposedly just cultural, then why was there so much violence in the past? The reality is that when you have a government that is committed to social stability, to reducing inequality, which of course inequality is a big driver of crime, reducing poverty, which is a big driver of crime, providing opportunities, stable infrastructure, and obviously there is an element of security. So it's true that there are a lot of cameras and everything, but they're actually used in a way to maintain peace. I mean, that's the most important thing that people want is a sense of stability and peace. And it's also a necessary precursor to development. I mean, it's a complicated catch-22, right? Because in order to reduce crime, you need to reduce social instability and inequality and poverty. Because there are racists who say, oh, it's just because, these minority groups in the US or blah, blah, blah. It's nonsense. It's racist. It's poverty results in more crime. This is true everywhere around the world. And so you need to have poverty reduction, but and also in many developing countries, in order to have poverty reduction, you need to have social stability. So it's a very complex social problem. How do you bring about economic development and social stability and reduce crime? And China managed to do it. And I think that everyone should try to study how they did that.
On gender also, China has a very recent history of being very patriarchal. So it's not that, they have been, there has been gender equity for a very, very long time that we see so many women and children on the street. These are definitely very recent progress that has been made in China. And you realize that when you speak to women in China. I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned, the leftward shift. in recent years in China in terms of government policies. And I wanted to pick up on that because the Financial Times, the leading business press, if you like, reports a lot on China, sometimes obsessively. And their China bashing ground is very different from, let's say, far right, hawkish, conservative. They would mostly talk about the leftward shift. They don't usually mention that, but they would say Xi Jinping's policy of overregulation. For instance, yesterday I read about this report on venture capital, and they said that for decades now, from 2000 onwards, Chinese innovation was driven by venture capitalists that led to like $1 trillion award. And now venture capitalists are leaving because of what's happening with Alibaba or Tencent, and not allowing market valuations in the stock market and so on. And even with the other analysis with the slowdown in macroeconomics and so on and so forth, their main line of attack is over-regulation, party meddling with markets, not letting the markets work. So could you tell us a little bit about what's your reading of this leftward shift in China in the recent years?
Well, I will say that that report in the Financial Times caused a huge scandal on Twitter. And there were many people who pointed out that the data they used were actually incorrect. And in fact, one of the sources that the FT quoted for that report on the fall in venture capital funding, one of the owners of the database that was used, it's a Chinese firm that collects his data. He tweeted out saying that it was incorrect, the report. So the FT journalist who wrote that has faced a huge backlash, and it does seem to be a completely misleading report. But despite the fact that the data, I think, are wrong, and the conclusion overall is wrong. It's this very hysterical thing, this hysterical claim that innovation in China is collapsing. It's nonsense. There's an element of truth in that the government has been cracking down on speculative investment, which is obviously good. I mean, that's something that should be welcomed. But when we look at venture capital funding, there is this narrative that the FT promoted and anti-China hawks promoted, that China can't innovate without private VC funding, which is nonsense. In reality, Stanford University published a report that found that the Chinese government is responsible for 6 times as much capital investment as private VC in what is known as venture capital funding. 6 times more state investment than private investment. And it also misunderstands where innovation comes from. Even in the US, which is supposedly like the utopia of VC, of venture capital and also private equity. We know there are a lot of it's funny that VC and private equity often get linked together, but we know that actually a lot of private equity funding goes into buying up hospitals, veterinarian clinics, nursing homes, businesses that were maybe not doing super well, but at least we're not losing money. They do these leveraged buyouts. They take on huge sums of debt. They then sell all of the assets owned by these companies, like their real estate, and then they rent that real estate. And then they trap all of these companies in debt, and then they go bankrupt. This happened to Red Lobster. This happened to Toys R Us. There are so many reports that private equity in the US that has been buying up these hospitals, that the services are significantly worse. The costs are significantly higher. Because, I mean, it's an easy business model. It's easy to explain. They not only do they trap all of these companies in debt and sell off their assets, but then they also lay off huge parts of their workforce. They force doctors to see twice as many patients and nurses to see twice as many patients. There are higher rates of death in nursing homes. It's a disaster. So it's funny that private equity is being used as a measurement to see how innovative the Chinese economy is, because you can call that innovative, but you can also call it destructive, suicidal, parasitic. Obviously, VC is a little more complicated because PE and VC are not exactly the same. But the reality is that even in the US, there's this narrative that US technological innovation comes from the constellation of VC investment firms in Silicon Valley. But that misunderstands where a lot of this innovation comes from. And this has been acknowledged even by some mainstream economists who are quite good, like Mariana Mazzucato, in her famous book, The Entrepreneurial State. She's someone who's done a lot of consulting for the US, for Western governments. She's not in any way, you know, like this kind of radical. She's a little heterodox, but she's relatively welcome in mainstream economic circles. And Mariana Mazzucato has shown how all of this major technology we use today ultimately comes from government funding, largely through the Pentagon. So the US never really abandoned industrial policy, even in the peak of the neoliberal era in the 90s and early 2000s, when industrial policy was basically considered tantamount to socialism and central planning. Even then, a lot of industrial planning industrial policy was done through the Pentagon and through things like DARPA. And she points out that DARPA is the Pentagon's brain, as it was famously referred to in Annie Jacobson's book, The History of DARPA. She's like the kind of semi-official government-friendly journalist who's like given the job of writing these books about the CIA and the Pentagon, kind of with their approval. And anyway, the point is that the Pentagon was responsible for the creation of technology like GPS, touch screens, many computer technology, the internet itself, as Yasha Levine showed in his brilliant book, Surveillance Valley. So there's this idea that you can't innovate unless you have a bunch of VC capitalists who are just investing in all these firms. I'm not saying that doesn't lead to innovation at all. I mean, there is some innovation. I'll be fair. Not all of it is useless, although a lot of it is useless. A lot of it you get like, NFTs, non-fungible tokens, like just people. By the way, that's another big part of US GDP growth and supposed financial innovation is people like selling each other cartoonishly inflated JPEGs of monkeys. And that contributes to US GDP growth and innovation, right? So what happened in China? In China, the government recognized that there was some of this speculative investment going on, and they cracked down on it. And the government has emphasized that they want investment, including from private firms, in the real economy, targeting specific sectors. And this is also leading to this discussion of the Chinese equity markets. Now, it's true that the Chinese stock market, if you have invested in it in the past decade, you've probably lost money. Whereas, the S&P 500 has skyrocketed in the US, the NASDAQ has skyrocketed because US policy in the US is created on behalf of stockholders, and the US government is committed to inflating the value of assets. And especially because not only are capitalists funding the US politicians who are making the policies, but also US politicians themselves have a vested financial interest in inflating asset prices because they're all invested in the stock market, as we see with these huge scandals that we've seen no consequences for of insider trading in the US Congress, where all of these, most of the major Congress people in the US are trading using their insider information that they have, which is by definition insider trading, and they're massively outperforming the market, and there are no consequences. Meanwhile, in China, government policy is not done on behalf of the stock market. So, some ultra leftists who criticize China will say China is not socialist, they have stock markets. Well, look at the capital markets in China. They have all been performing horribly. If you are a capitalist invested in the Chinese stock market, you're probably losing money. And by the way, you know who a lot of the investors are anyway in the Chinese capital markets? They're institutional investors. A lot of them are state-owned. They're pension funds, they're insurance companies. So anyway, the point is that if you look at the Chinese investments that are being made, they're often being done in a way where the state says these are strategic industries where we want electric vehicles, we want innovation in batteries, we want innovation in semiconductors. So basically what the government does is they say, okay, we will allow private investment in these certain targeted sectors. Where we will not allow private investment is in these sectors that are bad for social stability, like private education. So one of the problems that China saw in recent years, which is a very real problem, is that wealthier people in China were spending a lot of money on private tutors, including private tutoring companies So what happened is that their children would go to school, and then after school, they would go to these private tutoring companies, which, by the way, is also horrible for their kids because they have no social lives. They're all stressed out all the time. But what happened is obviously poor and working class people in China. I mean, obviously, absolute poverty has been eliminated. The government has lifted 800 million people out of poverty. But that said, there's not absolute poverty, but there still is relative poverty. There are still low income people in China, and they couldn't afford this private tutoring in these companies. So the government, it actually banned most private tutoring companies and is really trying to encourage more equity in education, because, and excluding international schools, all of the other schools are public in China. So they're really trying to encourage equal access to opportunities and resources for low income and high income children. That's one example. Another area where they crack down is obviously real estate. There were a lot of real estate firms that were engaged in these very financial speculative practices where, so for instance, Evergrande was supposedly a real estate company. It was actually kind of more of a financial company posing as a real estate company. And basically their business model was just pumping up the real estate bubble by taking investments to build, to ostensibly build real estate, but then they were using all those investments to fund further, to fund past construction that didn't finish. So what happened is you had this kind of Ponzi scheme where they get a bunch of investors who say, oh, we're gonna buy an apartment in this building that doesn't exist yet, and then they use that capital in order to finish construction in past buildings. So you have this bubble that keeps growing and growing and growing, and the government said we're not going to bail this out. And actually now, so obviously shareholders in Evergrande lost all of their investment, and furthermore, what's happening now with all of these projects that were left behind that were unfinished. Also, there were a bunch of corporate bonds that were taken out by Evergrande, and there was discussion of whether or not the government would bail those out as well. And they did not bail out those corporate bonds, even though there were some institutional investors invested in Evergrande bonds. So they really did not bail them out in any way. And instead, what's happening now is that some local governments, the national government in China, because it's actually more decentralized than people realize. The national government makes policy. It's not a federal system. They make policy, but then they allow local governments to determine how the policy will be implemented, right? And they oversee financing. So in the local governments, the federal government, it's not a federal government, excuse me, the national government, it's not federal. The national government made a policy recently that encourages the state and the local governments to use the unfinished housing to finish it and turn it into social housing. So now local governments in China are creating different funding programs to finish the unfinished Evergrande housing and turn it into low-income housing for low-income workers, for migrant workers. Okay, so they cracked on that as well, which is also a way of reducing inequality, right? Because because China has significant capital controls, and this is, I want to make a quick point. This might seem like kind of an aside, but when we talk about China's socialist system, I think it's so important to understand that if you think of it from the perspective of a capitalist, right? What is one of the main determining elements of capitalism, of the capitalist mode of production? It is that workers are forced to sell their labor power for wages, and capitalists extract their surplus value. Okay. But how is that surplus value stored? In what form? As Marx said, capital is dead labor. But what form is that dead labor held in? Well, in the most basic form is, you could say, a currency, right? But we all know that capitalists don't actually hold their wealth in currency. It's not a very good store of value. They invest that in some kind of asset. Well, in China, there are very significant capital controls. I think it's only 50,000 US dollars can be exported per year. And it's a little different for exporting companies, but for individuals, I think it's 50,000 US dollars worth of that can leave the country. So unless you're doing something illegal, which it does happen through like Hong Kong and Macau. There's like some shady black market operations to like to export capital, to to get across out of the capital control policies. But the reality is that most capitalists in China have to hold their assets in the form of Chinese assets or simply government bonds, Chinese equities. We've already talked about how Chinese equities have been very badly performing, probably lost money. And it's ultimately held in the form of some kind of asset that the Chinese state has control over, because all of the major banks are state-owned. So meaning that all of your savings accounts are actually effectively state-owned. So all of that surplus value that is produced has to go into some kind of asset, unless they're violating the law, that the state has control over. Obviously, government bonds are funding government spending. And then even you look at real estate. That was really the only major investment. You could say also equities, but in the end of the day, even if a company is not state-owned, the Chinese government often owns golden shares, which give them veto power over important decisions made by big companies like Alibaba or Tencent. So it's a way of making sure that the surplus value that is exploited by capitalists is still held in the form of assets that the Chinese state and the Communist Party ultimately has control over. And really one of the biggest investments that people could make was in real estate. And a lot of personal wealth in China was tied up in real estate. And it is true that over 90% of people, about 90% own their houses that they live in. But to be honest, a lot of those houses are very humble, right? So it's like a small apartment, or in the countryside, a lot of people in the countryside, they have like, a very humble house. It's not very good. The government has invested in modernizing these houses as part of the poverty reduction program, but they're not living, super luxuriously. So a lot of the wealth of wealthy people in China was tied up in owning multiple properties. So by popping the real estate bubble, real estate prices have fallen pretty significantly, especially in big cities. And that has hurt a lot of wealthy Chinese, but it's also a way of reducing inequality. And as houses become more affordable, you have lower income Chinese who are able to buy a house, which reduces inequality. And especially considering that if you're very wealthy, most of your income doesn't come from your actual job, it comes from capital income. And a lot of that capital income was actually simply through capital gains in the force of rising housing prices, rising house value. So, I mean, I know your question was ultimately about innovation. I talk about industrial policy, and you can see that obviously China is innovating very well. In semiconductors, it's catching up very quickly, not only in the most advanced chips, which people talk a lot about, but also what they call legacy chips, which are like a few years behind. And China is now dominating the entire global market in legacy chips. China is dominating in electric vehicles, in solar panels, and making other strides in other areas. So this idea that you only have to have private investment to have innovation is nonsensical. And I talk about how, in addition, as China is still innovating and investing heavily in certain technology sectors, China is also pursuing this campaign of common prosperity. And the idea is that, yes, in the short term, we will face some economic problems. There has been a fall in demand, a fall in consumption, but a big part of that is because high-income Chinese represented disproportionate amounts of consumption and demand. And now that income is becoming a little more level and low-income Chinese workers have more income, that means that the idea is that in the long term, aggregate demand will increase.
It's probably not very coincidental that when I was in China, I felt that the only economic area where I felt the pressure of inflation was rent. Not food, not transportation, not even buying of clothes, because they produce so much that prices are depressed. So that's one part of it. And the other part I was thinking was, it's not coincidental that this leftward shift that is so much talked about now coincides roughly with 2015, from where the stock market in China kind of starts not, its prices were not going up, and but the Financial Times never talks about the redistributive measures that were introduced more or less in those times, because it's essential to recognize that a lot of poverty reduction in China also comes through just producing for the export market. It's not like they were not traditionally, even after reform and opening, they were not traditionally through this targeted redistributive mechanisms to begin with, but some of those were introduced much later, particularly to deal with the most resistant layer of poverty to eliminate. Ben, depending on your time, I want to quickly ask you two questions, if your time permits, and if you don't have the time, I can. Okay, so let's go one by one. I want to ask you to respond to how the Jacobin covered the Venezuelan election. And we have had a full show on Venezuela with Joe Alexandra, so we're not going into the election. I wanted to ask you, given your experience in Latin America, this argument in Jacobin that Chavez was a revolutionary, he was progressive, his economic records were very, very successful on all grounds, and he was not an authoritarian. To say he was a Democrat, he conducted elections, he didn't ban oppositions to participate in elections, while they say that Maduro, his economic records are what they call abysmal, and the often cited parameter is the immigration, and his political records are also called as authoritarian, and some of the examples given are not conducting local elections regularly, banning some of the opposition leaders from contesting elections. So can you respond to this this idea that Chavez is somehow, he represents the Bolivarian Republic, while Maduro is increasingly betraying the Bolivarian revolution?
This argument is completely infantile, and ironically, it represents a kind of liberal argument that says that you have to understand politics simply in terms of the leader, the individual leader, and not the larger structure. If Chavez had not died in 2013, I think he would have faced many of the problems that Maduro has faced. Maduro has always been a wartime president ever since he came in. He has not had a minute in which he's been allowed to breathe. I mean, the U.S. has been trying to overthrow his government from the very beginning. Obviously, they were doing that to Chavez as well. Going back to 2002, in April, there was a U.S.-backed coup that was briefly successful. Then there was the oil lockout by, capitalist elements that were still in PDVSA, the oil company. And then you also have, by the way, the rise under Chavez of some of these extreme opposition figures like Maria Corina Machado, who created this group that was funded by the U.S. government, a so-called election monitoring group. And in fact, this narrative that they have that Chavez is this Democrat and Maduro is supposedly authoritarian is nonsense, because many of the same people, these extreme far-right opposition figures who have violated the law and have faced legal consequences, they face similar consequences under Chavez, like Maria Corina Machado, like Leopoldo López Mendoza. These people who are still around today, by the way, supposedly Venezuela is authoritarian, but they still have these extreme coup plotters that are allowed to continue operating and destabilize the country, or at least try to. So as for what changed, a lot of things changed. First of all, the macroeconomic climate, not just in Venezuela as a whole, but in the entire world. Chavez benefited from the commodity boom. And a lot of left-wing governments in Latin America and other regions of the world benefited from the commodity boom at the time. Chavez died in 2013. He came in 1999. He died in 2013. It coincided with the commodity boom, along with the Kirchners in Argentina, along with Rafael Correa in Ecuador, along with the Workers' Party in Brazil. They all benefited from this commodity boom, and they faced a lot of problems after. Now, not as severe as Venezuela, because they weren't as brutally as attacked as Venezuela was. They weren't put under a complete economic blockade like Venezuela was. Now, Venezuela also is cursed. It's both blessed and cursed with Dutch disease, with the resource curse, right? So Venezuela, for 100 years, well before Chavez was even born, has has had an economy that has been built entirely around oil. And when I say built around, I mean physically built. The entire infrastructure of the Venezuelan economy for decades has been built around the oil sector. And the vast majority of government revenue came from oil. So when the US starved Venezuela of oil revenue by putting massive sanctions on Venezuela, not only sanctions on Venezuela, but threatening secondary sanctions on foreign companies and governments that did trade with Venezuela, which obviously is going to encourage them to seek alternatives. This was a brutal, I mean, this was a complete blockade of Venezuela. Imagine if Saudi Arabia was not able to export its oil. What would their economy look like? Would they survive? I don't think they would survive a few years. It's actually a testament to the fact to how popular the Bolivarian Revolution is that Venezuela has been able to survive. It is absolutely remarkable that the government has not been overthrown. It's a testament to the fact that, as I've seen with my own eyes, I've been to Venezuela multiple times. I speak Spanish very well. I've done a lot of interviews with people in the streets of Venezuela, of average people. I know what average Chavistas, working class Chavistas think. The fact that the government has not fallen is precisely because they still have the support of a lot of poor and working Venezuelans. Now, as for the differences between Chavez and Maduro, I mean, it's also because right after Maduro came in, global oil prices collapsed. And you can say that I think Chavez did so many amazing things. Chavez is a hero. I mean, he will go down in history as a great hero, as a symbol of freedom, a symbol of resistance against imperialism and neocolonialism, fighting for the poor, creating social programs. Maduro has continued many of them, like, for instance, the Gran Misión Viviendas, which created now 5 million housing units, almost never talked about. It's amazing what they've accomplished. That has continued very much under Maduro. But Chavez also made some mistakes. Every leader makes mistakes. And you could say that one of those mistakes is that, for instance, some people say, even people who are supportive, that maybe they should have created a sovereign wealth fund. And instead of simply using the oil revenue to fund social programs, they should have used the oil revenue to invest in interest-bearing assets as part of a sovereign wealth fund, like some other big oil companies do, oil-producing countries do. I think that's a legitimate critique. And that's not, you can't just say that Maduro bad, Chavez good, because other countries that had sovereign wealth funds, when oil prices and commodity prices collapsed, they did face problems, but they didn't face as severe problems as Venezuela, but they also weren't under very significant sanctions. So you can also say that, for instance, that Venezuela made a mistake by pegging its currency to the US dollar for way too long, which allowed foreign speculators to just make so much money speculating off of, in the currency market, off of trying to depress the value of the Bolivar. I saw it personally. It was sadistic, and it was real. Like, just seeing every single day the central bank in Venezuela has to change the official rate, and there's a black market rate, and there's this horrible thing where all these foreign speculators, they just keep pushing down the exchange rate, pushing it down. They're making all this money. I mean, that was a real problem that, like, but that also goes back to the Chavez era. Like, and a lot of oil producing countries, they do peg their currency because they don't want to have an artificially expensive currency, because then you get the problem where it actually makes your exports less competitive, and it encourages more imports. So that the government had this policy that Saudi Arabia also has of pegging their currency to the dollar. Whatever. The point is that a lot of these economic problems were baked into the structure, and it didn't matter if Chavez did not die in 2013, he would have faced the same problems. But again, you cannot understand what happened in Venezuela without understanding the sanctions. It's by far the most important factor. You can say that the government made a few mistakes, whatever, but by far the most important factor is the sanctions. This has been acknowledged even by some mainstream economists who are not in any way Chavistas. There's been some reports, especially the Center for Economic and Policy Research published a very good study by a Venezuelan economist who's an opposition supporter. He's not in any way a Chavista. And he acknowledged that there are great charts in his report looking at the data empirically that You look, for instance, at Colombia, another major oil producer, a neighbor of Venezuela. You look at other major oil producers, and you look at how, with the fall in commodity prices after the end of the commodity boom, you saw that their oil production fell at a similar rate as Venezuela's, but they recovered. Whereas with the application of US sanctions, Venezuela's oil production continued to fall and fall. So I think, honestly, the fact that Chavez died when he did, it was obviously a horrible tragedy. He was a great leader, but in some ways, that's actually one of the reasons that he has this reputation for being like Chavez good, Maduro bad, from some of these like, respectable leftists who don't want to be criticized by the New York Times, right? And they say, well, okay, well, that narrative is now that Chavez is dead, the U.S. government is no longer afraid that much of Chavez because he's no longer the leader. So if you want to rehabilitate him, then fine. It's the famous quote from Michael Parenti. These people, these respectable leftists, they love every failed revolution and every martyr. They hate every successful revolution, every successful actually existing socialist project, because then you have to, deal with reality, which is very complicated. And yeah, Venezuela has been suffering, but Venezuela has been under brutal attack. It has been in a wartime economy for a decade now. And the fact that they've been able to survive is a testament to the fact that they still have a lot of popular support.
I was going through some of these GDP graphs from the World Bank, and I noticed this kind of upward trajectory in Venezuelan economy around 2021. And I was thinking like, where is it coming from? It was contracting, and I checked the oil prices, and it was more or less stable. And I don't know if there is any study, but the only thing I could correlate it to some of the restrictions easing off the sanctions that Biden did just after coming to power. Yeah, obviously, it's not lifting up all the sanctions. I think maybe 1,000 or I'm forgetting the number of sanctions are still there, but he did lift up some of those sanctions, and probably that had some impact on the recovery. My final question, Ben.
There's one quick note. There's also more local production. Now, it's true that one of the main drivers of the growth has been the fact that Venezuela has been able to export a little more oil, and it has also gotten support from the oil companies in Iran, in Russia, which are state-owned, by the way, which have alternative technologies, because this is another thing that's not that well understood, especially by the ultra-left critics of Maduro, that Venezuela's oil industry, all of the infrastructure and technology was built by U.S. companies over decades, right? And then when Chavez came in, he did kick out the foreign oil companies and completely nationalize the oil industry. But Venezuela doesn't produce all of the oil machinery that they need to maintain the oil refineries and the drilling and all of that. Like, you need to actually have the very advanced machinery. And it was all produced by US and German companies. When I was in Venezuela last, sorry?
The Chevrons and the BPs are still like big players in Venezuela.
Well, but not even just them. It's the manufacturers, like, where they like some of these are like German companies we've never even heard of, right? Last time I was in Venezuela, I was talking with a Venezuelan economist about how they were trying to get these German drilling parts, and they couldn't buy them because of sanctions. So that's a huge problem that Venezuela has had. And Iran, because it's been under sanctions for so long, has been able to develop alternatives. And Russia also has its own alternative technology for the oil sector. But replacing all of that is very complex, very long process. It's also very expensive. It involves a lot of capital investment. So, but I mentioned that another part of this is local production, which genuinely has increased. And this has been something that the government has tried to do for many years. Chavez, for instance, famously, he had this idea of trying to create a cell phone factory in Venezuela to produce very inexpensive cell phones. But, it's very hard to do, especially in a country that has, the resource curse. This is a problem that in every major economy that has large natural resources, they face this problem of first of all, the more you export and have a current account surplus, the more your exchange rate increases, which makes your exports less competitive, which means it's very difficult to have a manufacturing sector. But also it means that why would people go into manufacturing when they can just study oil engineering and get in the oil sector? Like there are few incentives to get involved in local manufacturing, just import everything. So Venezuela for many years has tried to reduce its reliance on imports, especially of food. And as recently as 2019, Venezuela was still importing 60% of its food. But that figure is actually still much better. Chavez was a great leader. I'm not criticizing Chavez, but even under Chavez, they imported much more. They imported the vast majority of their food. And he did want to reduce their reliance on food imports. But, this is at a time when oil prices are very high, commodity prices are high. They're still, riding that wave. When the oil prices fell, the sanctions were imposed, it became more and more urgent for Venezuela to produce more food. And from what I've heard recently, as of last year, that number has reversed. And now a Venezuelan economist told me that they'd produce now about 60% of their food. So in a few years, it's a huge increase. So obviously, that's not going to be a huge contributor to GDP. Agriculture, they're not like doing this for export. It's just for food consumption locally. But the point is that the government has tried to encourage, including through, industrial policy, including through private companies, not just state-owned companies, try to encourage more local industry, not just oil. But again, this is very hard to do. We even see that Saudi Arabia, which has all the money in the world, I mean, in terms of GDP per capita, one of the richest countries in the world, but even Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE are finding it very difficult to seek alternatives to the oil and gas industries, and they're not under brutal sanctions by the US.
It is so important to emphasize the point you made about the importance of technology and capital goods industry for post-colonial nations or late developers of global south countries. I do history of India and China, and immediately in the late 40s, after these countries became independent, one of the paradoxes was that on one hand, they had to grow rapidly because the consensus was to build the productive forces. On the other hand, for that, you need these capital goods and intermediary goods, which also meant huge pressures on balance of payment, importing inflationary pressures, and in many cases, actually squeezing the domestic market because now we have to produce for the export market to earn the foreign exchange through which you can actually buy the capital goods and intermediate goods. In the Chinese case, it also led to privileging of capital goods, which is the classic Soviet Union style before they came out of the reform and opening in the 1970s. Ben, my final question, and I appreciate so much your time, is probably the only friendly criticisms I have about the shows that you do, and this is the only video probably we disagreed on, was your coverage on the recent developments in Bangladesh. I think our disagreement was that you de-emphasized, at least the way we read it, you de-emphasized the popular support of the revolt that happened. We agree with you on all the reservations against people like Muhammad Yunus and the whole neoliberal gang. But I think if we read you correctly at India and Global Left, your story goes like it was essentially because you placed it within the League of Color Revolution. At least that was the context you presented. So the narrative comes up as if it's not just that US would be benefited. It's almost like US installing a puppet regime, while we read it as a popular revolt dislodging a government which was increasingly becoming unpopular for whatever reasons, and then the ruling elite trying to come together to capture the vacuum. So if you could respond to that criticism.
Yeah, well, I didn't say that it's like the U.S. installed regime necessarily, but definitely it's absolutely true, as you kind of obliquely acknowledged, that Muhammad Yunus is absolutely a U.S. asset. There are State Department cables from WikiLeaks that show that he's been collaborating with the U.S. Embassy for many years, that the U.S. Embassy was lobbying Sheikh Hasina's government on his behalf. but obviously there were large protests. I even talked about the protests in a video that I did, and how there were legitimate protests at the beginning over the quota system, which obviously does encourage nepotism, even though it's understandable why the government would want to reward people who fought in the Liberation War. But I mean, none of these instances of like these kind of color revolutions protests is ever exactly the same. So for instance, in Ukraine, in Ukraine, it's more clearly an example, I think, of a US-backed coup. I did talk about Ukraine in the video I did, which is maybe people thought I was saying that like it was a complete US coup, but in Bangladesh as well. But what happens is that you often have the beginning protests that may be somewhat justifiable. Now, in the case of Ukraine, they weren't really that justifiable. Actually, the protests originally were because the Viktor Yanukovych government rejected an offer to become part of the European Economic Community that required all of these privatizations and lifting government support for certain industries, typical neoliberal policies that were required by the IMF. And then you had all these protests, and then instead Russia offered him a better deal in Ukraine, and he signed a trade agreement. And then there were all these protests. And in the case of Bangladesh, I think it's more legitimate. But what often happens in a lot of these movements is you have these protests that start with maybe a legitimate element, and in this case, largely among students who obviously are frustrated by the fact that because of the quota system, they often cannot get many of these good government jobs that have benefits. Understandable. However, I think there were a lot of people who turned a blind eye to the strong involvement of the BNP, and even worse, of the Islamist elements of Jamaat-e-Islami, which is now they're very active in Bangladesh. Sheikh Hasina's government, the Awami League, etc., they had taken action against the Jamaat-e-Islami, restricting it. Immediately after she was overthrown, they reopened their office in Dhaka. They're very active once again in politics. It's obvious that the BNP is going to come back to power. I mean, like, they have this two-party system like many countries do. Realistically, it's going to be the BNP in power next. And the reality is that, I mean, you have to be realistic about these things. Like, yes, the protests were understandable and justifiable. And I know some people who were involved in the protests at the beginning who later were very critical of what happened, because their goal was not to necessarily overthrow the government. Their goal was to reform the quota system. But then what happens is that you have these young people who often are very justifiably upset about corruption. And the government, although there has actually been impressive economic growth in Bangladesh, it's true that a lot of that is in like the garment sector. There is some industrial development happening, but there's also a lot of inequality still, a lot of brutal poverty, and the corruption makes that even worse. Although, come on, do you think the BNP is going to be better when it comes to any of these problems? It's a difficult situation. Obviously, I'm not Bangladeshi. I'm not going to lecture anyone. I received a lot of messages from people who were sympathetic, at least to maybe their parents had been involved in the Awami League historically, and maybe they agree that there was corruption in the government, but they thought that it's kind of like an ANC situation in South Africa, that you look at the political parties that exist and you say that, well, maybe this party does have this origin in a developmentalist movement through the Bangladesh Liberation War. And there were left-wing elements in the beginning. Certainly, I mean, the father of the nation, Sheikh Hasina's father, was coming from a left-wing nationalist tradition. Within her party, there still are. It's kind of like Congress in India. Like, I understand that the Indian National Congress is still a pretty neoliberal party today, but there are elements of developmentalism that exist, like in the ANC in South Africa. And now it's going to be the right that comes to power. So, yes, there are people who are protesting, but you can't be naive about this. The U.S. was deeply involved in supporting these protests, and then Sheikh Hasina comes out. This is by the way, this was before, the Indian media, for BJP, obviously, they have a vested interest in exaggerating the role of the Islamists. And they are very Islamophobic. No one's denying that. They have treated Indian Muslims horribly. But Bangladesh is a very different country. It's not India. Bangladesh is a Muslim majority country where there are actual extremist elements, and especially that are linked to the BNP and Jamaat-e-Islami. And people accusing like Sheikh Hasina of being a puppet of like Indian Islamophobes is hilarious. I mean, Sheikh Hasina, all the people around her are Muslims, but they're not Islamists, right? And now what we're seeing is that, uh, so there's this narrative that says that Sheikh Hasina was an Indian puppet and that she was Islamophobic, and they're exaggerating the element. No, I mean, a lot of the stuff that they were talking about was before she was overthrown. And by the way, she had grown much closer to China and Russia as well. Bangladesh was playing a non-aligned policy. Good relations with Russia historically, bad relations with China because China had, unfortunately, for tragic historical reasons, had basically supported Pakistan in the genocide against the Bengali people during the Liberation War because of the Cold War, because China took this ridiculous position in the Sino-Soviet split of allying with Pakistan, whereas India had allied closely with the Soviet Union. So for historic reasons, Bangladesh had not had very good relations with China, although recently they had improved. Sheikh Hasina said that Bangladesh wanted to join BRICS, that they already joined the New Development Bank. So anyway, the point is that there was this narrative that after Sheikh Hasina left and she went to India, she wrote this letter saying that the U.S. wanted to create a military base in southern Bangladesh. And then there are people who say, well, this is actually fake. Then her son goes on Twitter and says this is not a real letter, that it was faked. Well, but I mean, she actually said the exact same thing before she was overthrown in a speech she gave last year in the parliament. She said a white man, it's obviously the US government, a white man was threatening me and saying that all of our problems would go away if we built a military base. I mean, it's kind of surprising how similar it is to Imran Khan in Pakistan. Imran Khan's obviously different. Imran Khan is much more popular than Sheikh Hasina was. He genuinely has a huge popular base. But they're these leaders who, they're obviously not like hardline anti-imperialists. The U.S. is willing to work with them, but if they don't play ball with the U.S., then the U.S. is going to back these attempts to overthrow them and put someone more amenable to U.S. interests in power. Like, for instance, in Ukraine, no one is claiming that Viktor Yanukovych was like a great anti-imperialist hero. The U.S. was willing to work with him as long as he was willing to go along with the U.S. But at some point, he no longer serves U.S. interests, and they try to find someone to replace him. This is the same thing with Imran Khan. And I think a lot of people on the Pakistani left made the same mistake. They were like, Imran Khan is just another part of the oligarchy, and we should, support the ouster. And now look what happened in Pakistan. The situation is significantly worse. The military is in charge. Obviously, Bangladesh is a little different. And I do accept that Sheikh Hasina was much less popular than Imran Khan. But the reality is that she did represent a very deformed kind of tradition of this kind of developmentalist nationalist tradition going back to the Bengali Liberation War. Now you're going to have the BNP come to power, and you're going to have these people who were involved in the protests, by the way, much of which were violent. And there were elements of Jamaat Islami. These are the people who collaborated with Pakistan during the Liberation War, supporting Pakistan against the Bengali nationalists. These are the same people who are now going to come to power. These are the people that the U.S. historically has seen as more reliable allies. So I think obviously, I made it clear that I'm not going to like praise Sheikh Hasina. She's not Hugo Chavez, but you have to realistically look at the situation in these countries and say, okay, it's like the ANC with South Africa. I'm obviously very sympathetic to the leftists who tried to break out of the ANC. And now the ANC is making this horrific compromise of working with the old, apartheid elements. I mean, it's absolutely atrocious. But at the same time, like, if they have these massive protests that lead to a color revolution that lead to the overthrow of the ANC government, and then the apartheid people come into power, like, I mean, yeah, I understand that Bangladesh is in a very difficult situation, but we also have to be realistic and look at the role of the U.S. People like Donald Liu, who's this guy who was also involved in the coup against Imran Khan in Pakistan, and look at U.S. interests in Bangladesh. And I think now it's very likely that we're going to see a U.S. military base built in Bangladesh and a BNP government.
Yeah, I think I don't disagree with the concerns about BNP being the party that would eventually might replace the Awami League, given the Bangladesh is also a two-party system. I think my major criticism was that your analysis sort of lacked the internal element, and it was purely done from a foreign policy perspective, because it is true that there are much less introspection about neoliberal elements trying to take over or seize this vacuum. But it is also true, if you follow the Bangladeshi press, and I actually read Bangla, given like I am from Assam where script is the same, there is enormous self-critical public, there is enormous concern and self-criticism and reservation about the Jamaat-e-Islami. So it's, and that's also partly because a lot of these students are mostly liberals and they are not far right. It's not true that the movement itself is completely uncritical, that they are not aware of what the vacuum would lead to. And I think my final comment on this would be, like, I was thinking about, because I often try to listen to the voices on ground, and when in this case and this is what makes the Pakistani case and the Bangladeshi case different. When you listen to the voices on ground in Pakistan, almost everyone had sympathy with Imran Khan when it came, even those who were not traditional supporters of Imran Khan, who even read coming of Imran Khan as his alliance with the military, and then, you know, his ousted being ruffling the feathers of the military, even they were sympathetic with Imran Khan when he was toppled. But in the Bangladeshi case, the more I read from people on the ground, most of them were broadly sympathetic to the popular uprising that shook Bangladesh. And my final comment would be, I was thinking about how would you or your analysis would think about, let's say, the French Revolution in 1789, before, let's say, 1792, when the radicals, the Jacobins, took over. Because in 1789, it was mostly the absolutist French state that was dislodged. And imagine thinking about it from the foreign policy perspective, one would assume that, oh, now the English empire, the great empire, would be benefited because the only bulwark against the English empire was this French absolutist state. And now all these constitutionalists and Girondists and moderates, and those were the most active elements. Even though we talked about the French Jacqueries and the Saint-Culottes, it was actually those in the National Convention, the moderates, were most active in that phase of 1789. So an assessment of the French Revolution would be then, oh, it's and that was precisely the reason why the English elites, including people like William Wordsworth, were so jubilant with the French Revolution initially, before the revolution actually took more radical turn. Like, from the perspective you have just presented, we would say that, oh, we shouldn't support the French Revolution because that would now benefit. I mean, this is a sort of caricature.
No, but there's a huge difference. I mean, that was a revolution led by revolutionaries. We're talking about the overthrow of a government with protests that started with liberal students. It was not a communist party. It was not an armed, socialist group or something. It started with protests with liberal students, and then eventually you have, as the protests become more violent, you have the entry of right-wing Islamist elements. I mean, they're completely different. Like, you have to look at, okay, it's fine. Like, it reminds me so much of what happened in Syria. Like, fortunately, it didn't lead to a civil war like Syria, which was fueled by foreign powers. But you have these protests that start with these liberal elements that they say, we want, democratization, all this stuff. And then immediately the right must get involved. And ironically, now the Syrian government is much more popular than it was even before, because people see that basically the only alternative was far-right Islamists. And no one is defending Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League. I mean, even though they do have that kind of left developmentalist history, they obviously have gone pretty neoliberal, like the Congress in India. But look at the people who overthrew her. I mean, they're worse. Like, and I'm not saying like the whole lesser evil thing that we have to support Sheikh Hasina. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that if we were to, if there were like a neoliberal, centrist neoliberal government, and you overthrew it and you replace it with a far right government, like, how does that make lives better for the working people? Like, if you have an actual revolution, it's a very different situation. Like, you see how completely different those are, right? Like obviously there were elements of the Bangladeshi left who supported the protests, but they were not. They were like a small percentage of it. When your movement is driven by very reactionary elements, and even though you express concern about them, who's in the driving seat? And now look who's in the government in Bangladesh. It's all of the neoliberal technocrats. And then after, who are they going to be replaced by? Probably people who are even worse. Right now, it's just like you look at every single person in the government cabinet right now, and it's all neoliberals trained in the West around Muhammad Yunus. And then probably next is going to be the BNP. So like you end up even worse off where you were before. And it doesn't mean that you just like say that Sheikh Hasina is the best and we should like praise her, but like comparing it to a revolution is very different. This is like the whole thing in Syria. It was not a revolution. It started with these protests, and then they were co-opted by the extreme elements that were the ones most willing to use violence. And in Bangladesh, let's not be naive. There was a lot of violence. You can see it online. And I'm not saying that the original protests were justified, but when you start having violence and people shooting police officers and all this stuff and setting stuff on fire, and obviously the police are not really that committed. They're not going to sacrifice their lives. They're just getting a paycheck. Like, how is this going to get better?
Yeah, I guess I don't disagree with your general point that if the protests are led by clear far right elements, then obviously we are not going to support it. But that's I think where we are disagreeing with. I think in the Bangladeshi case, the protests were not led by the BNP. As far as I read the reports, it was mostly driven by students
At the beginning. At the beginning.
Yeah,
But they evolved over time.
I mean, and obviously, like the opposition party, which was banned for so many years, they try to expand seizing on the vacuum. But this is where I think I see it for instance, the Ukraine protest, the Maidan coup, and the Bangladeshi protest differently because they are the far right element were very clearly active from the very beginning, like the kind of shootings and the reports I read, maybe I missed out on some of this. They said that violence was disproportionately large from the state sector. So I think that's where we are reading the protest different. This is not to say that I don't disagree with you in terms of who might consolidate power after this vacuum is created. I'm also not sure if I completely agree with your reading of Sheikh Hasina's economic policies. I think even Bangladeshi government under Sheikh Hasina was broadly consistent with the neoliberal consensus. Even the garment industry and so on, those were not built based on massive state investment, whether it's education or so on and so forth. They were mostly built on the back of cheap labor within the consensus of producing for the world market. So I'm not sure if the neoliberalism that Muhammad Yunus would bring in Bangladesh would be significantly different from a very progressive economic. This is not to say that I don't disagree with your analysis of the person, the figure of Muhammad Yunus, who is this very much inserted into, and that you might be true. I don't know. But I think it appears that things are very clear to you. I think it's not that clear to me. And we have a lot of Bangladeshi viewers, many of whom would actually watch this and would comment on this. So I think we are less clear about some of these readings than it seems you are.
No, I mean, when in the video I did, I made it very clear that the Awami League has gone pretty far from its origins, and it kind of like left in India. But again, I'm just saying the same point again. This isn't justifying the two-party system, but it's reality. And you have to ask, what will be better for people, a BNP government, which is going to happen now, or the continued Awami League? Ideally, there would be a left-wing alternative, but unfortunately, the reality is that they're not anywhere close to state power. And that doesn't mean that we praise Sheikh Hasina, but we have to be realistic. And especially if we're looking at it from a foreign policy perspective, which is where my analysis was from. And my analysis was also like, look, even making aside from the analysis politically, like judging where these political forces lie. It's also just subjective that, as I showed, that the National Endowment for Democracy was funding some of these media outlets that were promoting the protests, that the US, if you look at WikiLeaks cables, historically has been much closer to the BNP. That's not to say that the Awami League is, again, a great, perfect left-wing organization, but historically the Awami League was a little more independent, a little more kind of non-aligned, and they do kind of have this national, less comprador element. I mean, they still are the national bourgeoisie, but they're not the comprador bourgeoisie. And now it's pretty clear what direction Bangladesh is going to go in. And hopefully there is a left-wing alternative. I really do hope that there is something in the future, but just looking at it realistically where the forces lie. It's like the Indian elections coming up, right? Like in the past Indian elections, the BJP did not do nearly as well as a lot of people hoped, which is great. I'm very glad to see that. Now in the upcoming elections, there's going to be a lot of debate about whether or not the different communist parties, the CPIM and other left-wing groups, whether they should, like they did in some different states in India, whether or not they should make like a broader alliance with Congress. I mean, it's a complicated question. I understand people on both sides. Obviously, I'm not Indian, I'm not Bangladeshi. It's not my place to judge like where they end up lying, whether or not they decide to form a coalition with Congress or with not, whether or not the Bangladeshi left should try to create some kind of union with Awami League or not. Those are complicated questions, but no one's arguing that we should make the alliance with BJP or make the alliance with BNP. And they're the ones that are in power in India and are probably going to be in power now in Bangladesh.
All right. I would agree with what you said, that just as you are not a Bangladeshi, neither am I. So our discussion was largely as outsiders trying to understand from a global
perspective. You have much more right to opine on this than I do.
Yeah, but I think I should be more careful than you are, given how unpopular Indians are and how dubious Indian governments, some of the, broadly it's grotesque fascist and majoritarian policies on Indian Muslims, which kind of affect the whole subcontinent. And broadly what some of the Indian policies in broader South Asia, presenting this impression of big brother that doesn't listen to the smaller states. So given we project ourselves as a South Asian left channel, we are very, very careful in not being, not voicing something too powerfully with the impression that it represents the whole of South Asia. With that, I thank you, Ben, for your incredibly generous time. It was such a wonderful conversation, and I do watch all your shows, and I encourage our viewers to see Ben's show and read him and follow him. So thanks, Ben.
Thank you. Keep up the great work. I watch many of your programs as well. You always have very interesting interviews. I checked out the one recently with Bruce Cummings, which was fascinating, on Korea.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have 2 requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.